Wow. Thank you, Kevin. That was amazing. I've got some words to say to introduce our next panel here, but I find myself at a loss for words with musing on a lot of what we just witnessed and heard. Thanks, Kevin, for filling in a large part of the center of the puzzle with those narratives of the bright line through the basin that is the river and the Grand Canyon. Next up, I'm privileged to introduce our next panel. To help build the picture of the puzzle, we're going to step outside its bounds by working outside the edge pieces and talking about extreme weather events, what we can do about them, and how that fits into our understanding and our management of this important river and basin that we all depend on. I'm Jeff Deems. I'm co-founder and CTO of Airborne Snow Observatories. I'll be facilitating our discussion today in this session. In addition to our esteemed panelists, who I'll introduce momentarily, a tip of the cap is due to Susan Martin, who is the CEO of Virga Labs and is the original convener and moderator of this session. We wish her well. She's been called away for a family matter, but her energy and vision really contributed greatly to this session, so thank you, Susan. Hydroclimatic variability has really been at the heart of life in the Colorado River Basin since time immemorial. Termed an exotic stream, the majority of the river's flow derives from snowmelt in just a small fraction of the basin, and then flows through 3 different desert ecosystems on its way to the Sea of Cortez. In doing so, the Colorado River system experiences environmental extremes just as a matter of course. Ancestors of today's tribal nations thrived and suffered through these variations. The development of the Colorado River Compact a century ago hinged on assessments of variable river flow, and now the negotiation of the new operating guidelines must reckon with how to interpret uncertain measurements in the context of historic and evolving hydroclimatic variability. With 30 tribal nations, 7 US states, 2 Mexican states, 40-some million people, and multi-trillion-dollar economies reliant on the river, variability in river runoff dynamics grows ever more important and impactful. Background variations in snow accumulation and melt, annual and multi-annual flow, subseasonal runoff timing, the North American monsoon, are now being forced by increasingly rapid climate warming, intensifying wildfires, dust on snow impacts, and other drivers, converging to heighten extremes and create challenges for understanding and managing this dynamic system. At the nexus here is our collective ability to monitor, model, predict, and plan to respond to and manage not just decadal behavior, but wet and dry extremes at many scales. We just heard from Kevin with his evocative and gripping description of the big water in the early 80s in the Grand Canyon, and we're currently dealing with impacts from a decadal scale hot drought. Legacies from ancient peoples and dendrochronology suggest that the Colorado River hydroclimate system is capable of producing extremes beyond what we have experienced in the past couple hundred years. Also changing over time are the tools that we can bring to bear to meet these issues. The challenges inherent and emerging in this critical watershed have spurred continual evolution and application of measurement, modeling, communication, planning, and policy tools. The burgeoning technical toolkit we have today is supporting an array of applications in management and planning contexts, all in the service of expanding and strengthening our ability to be resilient to a myriad of extremes, events at the margin of our experience or at the margin of our ability to respond. Each of our panelists has dedicated their careers to connecting technical knowledge of climate and hydrology to management and societal needs. These connections grow ever more critical as climate, watershed conditions, and societal pressures diverge from the conditions under which much of our water infrastructure and policy were devised. To expand on these topics, I am pleased to introduce and welcome our 4 panelists. Dr. Carletta Chief is a distinguished outreach faculty and professor and extension specialist in environmental science at the University of Arizona. As director of the Indigenous Resilience Center, she facilitates efforts of University of Arizona climate and environment researchers, faculty, staff, and students working with Native nations to build resilience to climate impacts and environmental challenges. Dr. Balaji Rajagopalan is a professor in hydrology and water resources engineering at the University of Colorado. He is a leader in basic and applied research into global hydroclimatology, water resources management, large-scale statistical analysis and modeling for application in diverse areas. He's the former chair of the Civil Engineering Department and has received awards for his pioneering research on Colorado River water resources management. Dr. Enrique Vivoni is the Fulton Professor and Director for the Center of Hydrologic Innovations at Arizona State University. His research focuses on water, climate, and ecosystem interactions with an emphasis on North American drylands. His team develops and applies innovations in hydrologic sciences and engineering for improved decision-making by water management agencies. And Dr. Julie Vano is the research director at the Aspen Global Change Institute, where she oversees their growing research portfolio, postgraduate fellowship program, partnerships with water agencies across the US, and grants from multiple US federal agencies. She works to develop partnerships to connect science and decision-making to help individuals, water agencies, communities, and society make better, more resilient choices in our changing climate. To kick off our discussion, I'll ask each of the panelists to provide some introductory remarks to see the discussion. Start with Dr. Chief.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. I am Bitterwater, born for near the water. My maternal grandfather is mini goats, and my paternal grandfather is red running into the water. That's how I identify as an indigenous scientist. Climate change is impacting Native Americans in unique ways due to the deep connection to land, tribal sovereignty, land tenure, and cultural uses. Tribes are diverse and unique and have rich tradition, cultures, language, and histories. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Over 5 million tribal members live across 33 states. There are over 60 state-recognized tribes, and 78% of Native Americans live on non-tribal lands. Nationally, many tribes are leading and curating their climate adaptation plans. The BIA funded 250 adaptation plans and renewable energy studies, and the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals conducted adaptation planning with nearly 400 tribes. Tribes developed their climate adaptation plans by incorporating both Western scientific data and traditional indigenous knowledges to identify vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies to mitigate the impacts. Indigenous peoples are including changing climate conditions and hazard mitigation plans by incorporating available climate data, making them eligible for hazard mitigation assistance grants. One widely used tool is the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. The development of specific tribal climate profiles are also important and useful for tribes to use and to incorporate into their tribal adaptation planning. Key examples of scientists who are assisting with climate data include the University of Arizona CLIMAS, University of Nevada, Reno Climate Native Program, among others. The USGS, in collaboration with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, also have tribal liaisons at their regional climate adaptation science centers. Science communication is key in providing climate education and data for tribes. Utilizing different forms of communication is important, such as radio or in-person teach-ins. Briefs such as bulletins and fact sheets, utilizing culturally appropriate content, climate terminology in native languages, and graphic visuals can be useful. For example, my team has used geometric pictographs to share water quality results for a tribal community working with Dene knowledge holders. We worked with the NetLinguist to translate climate change terminology into the Navajo language. For example, climate change was translated to when working with tribes on climate science, consistent and bilateral communication is required and can take different forms, such as listening sessions, focus groups, or university and community exchanges. Tribes often braid traditional knowledge by interviewing knowledge keepers to determine key ecological indicators for adaptation strategies, such as the restoration of fire-adapted ecosystems, cultural burning, and strategies for maintaining biodiverse crops and culturally important species and landscapes. However, indigenous data sovereignty, tribal engagement, and tribal approvals are required. A useful tool is the 2014 guidelines for considering traditional knowledges and climate change initiatives. In this work, our team outlines steps in working with tribes. It's critical for tribes to lead this process for assessing how climate change will impact their land, resources, culture, and livelihood. In Cozetto et al. 2013, we presented the Climate Change Vulnerability Framework for Native Americans, where 5 factors were needed to be considered. These are socioeconomic, political, infrastructure, ecosystem services, and spirituality and culture. These factors are interconnected and they enable response to climate hazards. Socioeconomic conditions can affect management of tribal water resources and the ability to respond to climate change. Political factors include the unique political position of tribes as federally recognized tribes. Tribes have federally reserved water rights. However, many of these tribes have yet to define their water rights. They're either in litigation or settlement, and many are still in the process of negotiating. On November 19, Governor of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, signed the Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement Act and the Yavapai Apache Nation Water Rights Settle Agreement. The Navajo Nation, Hopi Tribe, and the San Juan Southern Paiute Tribe will settle their water rights claims in the Colorado River, Little Colorado River, and groundwater. These tribes have been engaged in legal battles for over 60 years, and if affirmed by Congress, these agreements will end the tribes' long struggle for water security. Infrastructure factors include tribal water infrastructures that can be lacking, inadequate, or poorly maintained, thus increasing the tribe's vulnerability to flooding, drought, and waterborne diseases. Infrastructure damage can increase costs that can quickly drain tribal finances. Even without climate change impacts, 12% of Native Americans lack safe and adequate water supplies. Fourth is cultural, The fourth, groundwater supplies, fourth is ecosystem services, which include impacts to substances and cultural activities such as fishing, ranching, and gathering of medicinal plants. Groundwater supplies 93% of tribal water systems, and risk assessments often do not consider the deep connection to the environment. For example, in the San Juan River, after the Gold Key mine spill, my team identified that the Navajo people use the river in 42 different ways. The final factor is spiritual and cultural. Native Americans are intimately connected to the places in which they live. They are keepers of complex and extensive bodies of ecological knowledge passed down through generations. They strongly associate with cultural identities that are connected to their waters and the lands. And mountains and spring waters are held sacred and used for ceremony. In addition, many tribes respect and hold sacred the individual role of different species. Traditional knowledges may be able to extend the environmental record in these data-sparse regions, improving monitoring design, and contributing to further future adaptive capacity of tribes. In conclusion, tribes have an urgent need to prepare and to respond to climate change, and to do so in a holistic way that considers cultural values. Uncertainties in predicting these impacts because of uncertainty in model projections, lack of community-specific climate and water resources data, and unpredictable interactions among changes, impacts, and factors. For Native Americans who have been left out of discussions, it's important that adaptation planning be participatory and transparent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that nice introduction. It's my honor to participate on this panel with distinguished colleagues here and also distinguished members in the audience, colleagues with whom I have worked over the years, and I look forward to the interesting, engaging discussion. What I'm going to present in my remarks are some general reflections from two of our recent studies, and then I'll close out with some parting thoughts to spawn the conversation. So the first of the two research insights is the role of precipitation variability at decadal timescales on the historic and future flow variability. And this is from one of our recent papers, Horling et al., 2024 in Journal of Climate. The title of this meeting is Piecing or Putting the Puzzle Together. And it is quite apropos because what we are going to offer is another piece to the puzzle so as to make the puzzle more whole and more complete. So the first insight or takeaway is that 83% of the observed decadal variability in leaf-free flow is explained by the upper Colorado River Basin precipitation. So I'll be throwing some numbers, so please bear with me. But generally, you will get the idea. 83% of the observed decadal flow variability is explained by the precipitation in the upper basin. And so it is the principal engine engine that drives the hydrologic variability. In contrast, the decadal flows are only weakly constrained by temperature, explaining less than 5% of the decadal flows during 1950 to 2020. So that's sort of an important point to reflect on. The second important piece is that the leaf-free precipitation relationship during the period of 50 to 2020 has a characteristic elasticity of about 2. What does that mean? Which means that twofold increase in decadal runoff anomalies per incremental decadal precipitation anomaly exists. So, which means if a unit anomaly of precipitation comes about, it results in two times the anomalous flow in the river, indicating that moderate precipitation changes generate outsized flow changes in the river. There is a depleting effect of the temperatures, definitely, on leaf-free flow when decadal conditions are warm, but its magnitude has low confidence owing to minimal variance that it explains, which I mentioned above. 3, an increase in upper basin precipitation of about 2.5% during 2026 to 2050, the next period of the renegotiation, due to climate change alone, is projected by almost 70% of the models. So more than 70% of the models project about 2.5% increase in precipitation in the upper basin. The magnitude of this is not negligible. For this is about half the magnitude of the internal variability that the river has, the internal variability meaning the variability that it would have regardless of anthropogenic climate change. And this is a pretty large spatial footprint of wet, with increases projected to occur throughout much of the western United States in these CMIP models. Increased precipitation in the upper basin due to climate change, which alone increases 5 to 7% relative to the 2000 to 2020 climatology, the decadal flow in the river, just from that 2.5% increase in precipitation can get to 5 to 7%. Depending on the temperature, of course, this signal temperature, which has a depleting effect from warming of about 1.5 degrees centigrade. Finally, critically large intrinsic decadal variability in precipitation, which is variability in precipitation that is just natural, is about 5% of the climatological mean on a decadal time scale, which yields a range of flow for us to consider in the planning much wider than what has been previously thought. So the overall precipitation-induced leaf-free flow change would range from about minus 25% to about plus 40%, contrasting to minus 30 to minus 5% if we only use or only consider temperature. So the piecing of the puzzle is that bringing the precipitation makes the puzzle more complete, and it tells the story much more. With just the temperature, the story is only half complete. Consequently, extreme low and extreme high flows are more likely. So this is what we we uncovered in our study in this Horling et al. Paper. The second study, which is still undergoing, in this we assess the risk of the millennial drought using both historical and also paleo flows. And what we find is that the millennial drought of the type that we are undergoing, 20-year stretch, average flow being less than 12.5 million acre feet, is about 5 to 10 times more likely to occur than previously thought from the paleo record. So in other words, what we are going through is more likely in the past from tree rings record, which goes all the way up to almost 2,000 years back. Using some simple storage yield models, what we find is that on an average, 12.5 million acre feet per year has about 95% and higher reliability. And 15 million acre feet, which is sort of the number that is put in most of our agreements and the management regime, is only 85% reliable on an average. And 16 million is even less than that, about 67%. So some parting thoughts. Number one, we must contend with a wide range of variability, minus 25% to 40%. Two, the risk of flow magnitudes is to be recognized, the risk of those magnitudes that are there in these agreements. And the risk must be reflected in any agreements or any renegotiations that we come up with, because so far these numbers seem to suggest that they are reliable every year 100% of the time. And what we are finding, both lived experience and also from all analysis, is that the numbers come with reliability and there is a risk, and that risk needs to be reflected in these agreements. And on a hopeful note, what we posit is that if these risk is incorporated in these agreements with a change in paradigm to a more risk-based management, that can enable as a sustainable water resources into the future. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to have about 5 minutes of remarks. My name is Enrique Vivoni. I'm going to do this by a few questions. First, who am I? Why am I here? Why are we here speaking to you today? We're part of a large group, the science community, if you will, the applied science community, that's a backbone for the types of hard decisions that this group needs to make. I'm a professor at a university, Arizona State University, I'm a director of a center, the Center for Hydrologic Innovations. And what we do is develop technical projects with stakeholder input. These stakeholders are typically water management agencies. And to do that well, you have to listen. You have to listen hard, and you have to collaborate, talk. There's a lot that can be learned from the water management community, and there's a lot that can be offered by universities, research centers, institutions, other scientists and engineers and federal and state agencies. And we try to translate, if you will, the findings from the scientific community into the user community. You all. How do we interpret all of the information that's coming out of climate science? How do we interpret the impact of that climate uncertainty and its changes to the river flows? How is that going to impact our short-term decisions this year? Our long-term decisions, things that go out 100 years. And a backbone for this type of conversation is the use of models. And the word model usually turns people off. We don't pay attention anymore if you hear the word model, especially if there's models of models, or what I'll call today the modeling chain. How is it that we are here today, being able to tell you all what might happen 100 years from now in the Colorado River? How is that even possible? What are the uncertainties involved in these predictions? So the modeling chain has been constructed over about 50 years, and it involves hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists who dedicate their entire careers to model. Now, they might be modeling different portions of the system. And this begins with, we're on a rotating planet that's going around a star. And that planet has an atmosphere and a general climate state of today. So we need to model that system first. Think of these climate models as models of everything that's happening in that envelope around the sphere that we all live on. And the climate models are useful. They could tell us something about the future, especially when we use them in scenarios, in what-if conditions. What if humanity did this? What if humanity kept on this current trajectory? But we live in the now and the local. We don't live in the global, do we? It's hard for us to think outside of our one river basin, the Colorado River. So this modeling chain then includes other models that try to take the information from those global models and bring them to our application of interest, whatever that might be. In this audience, it's river flows in the Colorado River. How do we do that? First of all, we have to evaluate, are these models any good for our region? Do they reproduce the past? For those models that reproduce the climate of the past in our region, and we have a series of steps that allow us to use that information into what I'll call a watershed model, a model of the Colorado River Basin. This is a huge watershed. It's really complicated. Today's beautiful opening talk showed us visually how complicated just that one piece of the basin is, the 277-mile stretch. The basin's much more than that. The complexities are much more than those. So watershed models or hydrology models, they tend to make oversimplifications of the Colorado River because it's such a big system. Those simplifications might include, we don't do a great job in these models in tracking the interaction between the river and the groundwater aquifers that are located throughout the river basin. That's an example. Those models then give us information at critical management locations on the river. And then we have other models. These other models tell us what are the decision points and triggers related to policy and regulations that indicate how we operate the plumbing of the system that we call the Colorado River. So think of this modeling chain as having huge uncertainties. We only think about the uncertainties perhaps in what will be the future precipitation or what will be the future temperature. But there's also uncertainties in each of those steps of the modeling chain. So that's a little bit about question number 2, what do modelers do? Question number 3, why should you care? How is this relevant to your day-to-day operations decisions? Well, we're here to express to you that there's a community of scientists and engineers, policymakers, in the background of your day-to-day operations that are here to also serve society as you do. That we work in the public interest, that we're neutral, that we're going to assess the facts as we see them given the evidence at hand. And that we're constantly trying to improve our methods. We apply, we adapt, we improve the tools along this modeling chain to give you better answers. And that's a difficult process because it's iterative. What I might tell you today about river flows might change a year from now because portions of the modeling chain were improved, because we reduced the uncertainty in a certain part of the modeling chain. But in order to have these models work for your benefit, and in fact for the benefit of society in our river basin, we need you to interact with us, to tell us what's important. This is a crucial piece of bringing the management community, the decision makers together with the scientists. What is it that's most important for you to represent in the model? What are the pieces that really matter for that negotiation that you're trying to achieve? And which are not important? Where do we focus our energies to get more data to test the models, to do additional analyses with the models, to improve the models themselves? Help us focus, target our effort, these hundreds or thousands of scientists that are working for the public benefit in the background. Help us get there so that you'll have improved tools for making the decisions that you need to make. And with that, I'll conclude my opening remarks.
Great. So I was asked to talk a little bit about how do we translate the science into decision making. And so how does the work that we just heard about really become relevant to the decisions that you all need to make? So I'm often at the boundary between the science and the decisions. I'm a scientist, but I have the great privilege of working really closely with water managers. And so from that experience and for this panel, I've boiled it down into five key ways to support better use of science in decision making. And so first, I think we need science synthesis. So recognizing that decision makers have a lot going on and they don't have the time to find the research, to digest the pages and pages of findings, and then recognizing that, as has been mentioned, the science is evolving. So how does one study compare to another study, and what does that all mean? As such, I think synthesis can really help. This comes in many forms. It's people sharing, like for instance here, it's through products. In 2020, the Western Water Assessment did a State of the Science report for the Colorado River that many in this room helped to support. There's an effort underway envisioned by Brad Udall that I'm a part of that is creating a Colorado River Science Wiki that is aimed at compiling and helping to explain what the latest science is. It's currently a repository, a collection of the latest publications in the science with some context. And the goal is for it to be kind of an ongoing location where people can come to learn like what is the newest results in the science community. Synthesis can be helpful, but that really only gets us so far. So I think when it comes to applying science in a particular circumstance, we really need guidance. So number 2 is guidance. So what is it that I should use for my region, for my particular decision? Again, to get guidance, this comes in many forms, some of which we've heard a little bit about already. One is directly from people in conversation. There's trainings where there's engagements or workshops where people learn about what climate science information is and how it's being used. There's a lot of documents out there. I was a part of an effort to do do's and don'ts for using climate information in water planning and management several years ago, but since then there's been a lot of other efforts. I think the Department of the Interior recently released one that is best practices on using climate information, and there's a whole lot of other ones out there. There's guidance if you're looking for wanting to use climate change information. There's so many different portals and places you can go to get information. There's actually a guide to the climate portals, which helps to describe what each of the portals offers and hopes to align the type of decision that you're looking to get assistance with what portal you might want to look at. And then recently, just this past month, there's now a new frequently asked questions on using the next version of global climate models, so CMIP6, and questions that were created by the Water Utility Climate Alliance, and I worked, but the effort led by Jeff Lucas to answer those questions in a way that is hopefully accessible and useful to the water management community. So often short conversations or online links is enough, but sometimes you do want to go deeper, and so number 3 is we need collaboration between researchers and decision makers. Again, what's been talked about to some extent already, and I see it happening in this basin, and it makes me really excited, and I think it's happening more frequently and needs to happen more frequently and needs to be amplified. The Colorado River Climate and Hydrology Working Group is really instrumental in doing this. Reclamation has science and technology programs that are funding this work. There's a lot of other efforts underway, and so that collaboration is really important and critical. And while it's great, I think this one-on-one working together isn't always feasible. Like, we just don't have the capacity to do that everywhere. And we also want to be able to learn from each other. So my number 4 is the need for coordination amongst efforts. And so who is doing what where, and how can we learn from one another? There's boundary organizations that are trying to make those connections. That includes the CAP-RISAs, so the Western Water Assessment, CLIMAS, CNAP, also Climate Adaptation Science Centers, the Colorado River Working Work Group, and then also increasingly, in order to share best practices or ways in which things have worked for one group or another, there's increasingly case studies that allow people to talk about how they used information or how they navigated the space of how to go about using information. And those case studies I see, and I see more commonly, and I think the need for that is going to increase over time and really helps in this translating of science to decision making. And then finally, I really think this is important, that we need to take all of these conversations and all of these insights and feed it back into directing the science. And so, as kind of already alluded to already, the importance of the science community helping to support the actions on the ground. There are a lot of knowledge gaps still out there, so things we need to explore. And I think we can do it best when we're guided by knowing what type of information would be most beneficial to you all. So I think that's going beyond just kind of a needs assessment, but going into conversation and being able to engage. And how does that work? It's finding ways to incentivize and support engagement. And so I would love to have conversations throughout this week of what would work best for you, how could we build those collaborations and carry them forward. So a quick summary: we need science synthesis, we need guidance, we need collaboration, we need coordination, and we need feedback to science in order to help in this translation of getting the best available science into the decision-making work, and then the decision-making questions back into the science.
Fantastic. Thank you all. We've got days worth of material to discuss here. Let's dig in a little bit. I think all of your comments taken together really kind of set the stage for us to dig into the extreme events topic. So given the increasing variability in climate patterns that we see, how can we better predict and prepare for extreme events? And to me, this is in contrast to a way that we maybe typically think about climate change as evolving towards a new steady state. You know, what is the climate like in 2050 and planning for that new average? When in reality, it can be the extremes that are really the thing that's gonna drive what we need to do.
So I would be happy to take a first crack at this question, and then I look forward to what my fellow panelists think. I mean, I think in terms of predicting and preparing for extremes, I'm first going to pull something from social science, and it's been shown that the stronger and more connected and more tied to community you are, the better off you are when it comes to managing extremes. So just, I think having forums like this where you're even just talking about these extremes might happen and what do you do about them builds those connections that help navigate when extremes do come. But I think, I mean, from the hydrologist perspective, I think recognizing entering a world where hydrology of the past, while helpful, might not encompass all we're gonna see in the future. And so models can be really helpful tools in exploring this and help us to think differently. But I think we need to remember we're using them as tools and know that they cannot predict what the future is. But that said, there are ways to use them effectively. I think it's important to make sure whatever model you use is fit for purpose. And I think this is particularly important when you're thinking about extremes. So kind of this chain of models approach, like you're starting with the global and going to the very local, it does not do great at thinking about extremes. And so I think we have to be creative in thinking about how we explore extremes and not just rely on a chain of models approach and think about the processes at play and ways in which we can understand the system more. I also think it's really important that we improve observations. What is it that we can currently observe, and be that precipitation, snow, soil moisture, both on the ground and then also through things like remote sensing that can help us to directly in times of extreme to understand the extreme and be more proactive about it, but then also help us to improve our understanding of the process and understanding of our models so that then we can think forward and do better predictions or better estimations of what the future might be. And then I think it's, as has already been said, improving connections with the science community, acknowledging like we are learning as we go. I think as this world is changing, like new things are happening and we're constantly learning. And so to keep that learning mindset, but to have ways in which what we're learning can be more quickly integrated to the decisions that are being made. And then finally, I think recognizing everyone is grappling with these extremes, and so look at and see how others are preparing, both within the basin and then with other arid river basins around the world.
Thanks, uh, thanks, Julie. To add to that, one way to think of extremes is it is the variability of the extremes. And I think from on the Colorado River, which is unique compared to a lot of the other systems in the world, is that we have a lot of storage. So we can buffer when you get when you get a pluvial period, you can store the water and then use it subsequently, which is basically what happened in the current drought. So it is the magnitude and frequency, I think, is what, at the essence of what we need to be more concerned. As Jeff mentioned, if there is a general steady state increase, for example, if we are going to gently reduce the flows by 15% over a 50-year period and nothing else is going to happen, we can devise strategies to manage that. But the problem is, on top of any of those kind of gentle trends is superimposed this variability. And so it will serve us well to think of that variability. And the last point is, which I alluded to in my remarks, there is significant variability that is already, the river has exhibited in the past 1,000, 2,000 years. And it will be good to look at that, and as they say, past is prelude, certainly in this case, to see what kind of variability we might be seeing in the future and how to put it in some kind of a historical context. So if our management strategies and regimes can recognize that, and if we collectively recognize that and manage for that variability, I think that will get us or put us into a more sustainable path. And a point that struck me, maybe many of you know, are one of our wonderful former colleague who passed away, Kelly Redmond. I remember vividly, he used to tell Balaji, on the Colorado River, drought is not the story. We are in a semi-arid place, it's always dry. But it is those frequency of wet years that come in and replenish the system. Pay attention to how that frequency changes. That is where much of the story is in terms of the management. So I always realize, I always remember that more so, at an occasion like this.
Enrique, you mentioned in some of your remarks the scenario tools in the model chain as an effective mechanism. That seems like something that might be appropriate for addressing the extreme events that Julie and Balaji are talking about. But the flip side of scenarios is that those scenarios need to have relevance to the topic at hand. And that's where I think communication with the diverse stakeholder groups and folks who are actually making decisions on the ground is kind of that key topic. So I wonder if you and maybe Carletta can talk about the use of scenarios in a modeling framework to address some of these extreme event risks, and then the importance of how we develop those scenarios.
I'm happy to start. We talked about uncertainty, and if you're putting together many models and each model has uncertainty, then the uncertainties explode. They're huge. And scenario planning is one way of trying to understand and bound that uncertainty. But even it is difficult to comprehend. When you're in a stakeholder engagement workshop and you've presented the outcomes of the Colorado River Basin flow, and it's a spaghetti diagram of lines that all seem to be going up and down, the natural question is, which one's right? And how certain are you in that spaghetti diagram of river flows? How do we reduce uncertainty? Well, one way is to pose in scenarios simpler to understand approaches. Okay? In the Colorado River, it's going to get warmer. Some models say it's going to get warm, and some models say it's going to get hot. It's not going to get cold. So perhaps one scenario distinction is warm versus hot. And that's going to impact primarily the snowfall, the snow melt processes, how long the snow lasts on the landscape, and the spring snowmelt runoff. The precipitation can go either way. You mentioned this. You know, one way of encapsulating or quantifying or getting our heads around that uncertainty is selecting scenarios. Maybe a dry future, a normal future, a wet future, the very desirable, very, very, very wet future. Everyone's drawn to that one because it helps us overcome, to some extent, the temperature effects. So in the scenario planning process, using these types of descriptive tools will help us understand how this translation between the climate forcing happens to the river flows. Now, as I said, all of these models have uncertainties. And we mentioned earlier, the scientific community is always improving our models. And I have a little story, like, if I may, about this, and it's related to scenarios as well. So it happens that the global models tell us precipitation. They typically don't tell us if it's snow or rain. I think we care about whether it's snow or rain. And the hydrologist, using a hydrology model, has to somehow take that total precipitation and assign it into all snow or all rain or some mixture. That's a big decision because it either develops a snowpack or it doesn't. Well, it turns out that many models use a very simplified algorithm to do this. When you confront that algorithm with observations, it fails. And a very simple replacement, instead of using air temperature, you use something called the wet bulb temperature that accounts for how warm the air is and how humid the air is. It improves a lot, this partition in between rain and snow. Getting that right matters. Getting that right matters for the model. Getting that right matters for the scenarios that you're presenting. Getting that right matters for the future envelope of Colorado River Basin flows. So this is an example, if you will, of how interacting with stakeholders can pinpoint our focus on something that we've ignored, that we've for 25 years used the wrong algorithm, so that these scenarios are more realistic, they can be used. Decisions can be made based upon them.
So I work with tribes in water, the food energy water nexus, and so I think when we're talking about these extremes, we have to remember that many tribes don't even have their water rights settled, and 12% of Native Americans don't have access to water, and on the Navajo Nation, it's been cited as 30%, though in our studies, we've seen much higher percentages of people who don't have access to running water, much less clean water. And the water that are being used, like on the Navajo Nation, can be non-potable sources that are alluvial groundwater sources that are subject to, these drought periods. So when we're talking about these extremes, I think the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted these water insecurities and how big of an impact it can have on tribal water users, where Native Americans were 2 to 3 times more likely to die of COVID, where the everyday water user has the access to wash their hand for 20 seconds, multiple times a day, and where the tribal water user is very conscious of the water they use for hygiene and non-drinking water purposes. So there's 2 sides of this coin where, like for example, earlier the talk with Kevin Fedarko, he was showing these sandstone pools. My mother used to wash her babies in these sand pools. That's how my mother used water. when she was young. And so one side of the coin is the resilient side of indigenous people, where they have been able to steward the land for time immemorial. They understand the seasons and the different uses of water and growing of foods, saving of these foods, like through early heirloom seeds, things like that. That's the resilient side, the conservation steward side. And I think the other side is the vulnerability side, where you could say, talk about lack of access to water insecurities, food insecurities, health, lack of access to health, things like that. And I think together, having tribes settle their water rights and being able to build resilient water infrastructure systems will help them to be prepared for these climate extremes. And at the same time, layering that with the indigenous resilience of the people that they know how to steward their land. And I believe together with securing of their water rights, building the water infrastructure, and the resilience of being a steward, that they would be able to adapt to these climate extremes. There's so many facets of that as well, in terms of the impacts of history, the government, where a lot of these practices have to be revived and relearned. Like, for example, when there's a heat wave, where do people go now? Because, cooling centers aren't common, but many years ago, there used to be these arbor shade houses where people would find a refuge during heat, where they would be able to have that outdoor ventilation. So things like that, I think it's combining those two and getting people to be in those conversations, because some of those extremes are need to be addressed now, just because the equity is not there right now today. So that's where these modeling scenario workshops are really important, to share different scenarios and then have these discussions with tribal land users, tribal environmental managers, tribal leaders, to talk about how they can develop mitigation plans. And the best way to implement it is to integrate it into their existing plan, not have just a simple separate climate adaptation plan, but really talking about it holistically. And that's where science communication and engagement is really key, and implementing the science into these management plans is just really something I really enjoy and am committed to. Thank you.
Awesome. I really like how you put or contrasted the resilience and vulnerability. I think it's particularly acute in the communities you're describing, but I think it could also apply a lot more broadly. We obviously, vulnerability studies are a common tool for assessing risk, but I think pairing those two, that resilience and vulnerability, could almost be, in effect, a scoring mechanism or a way to think about the challenge such that we can adapt, develop models to support those challenges, or to evaluate some of the model challenges we have. In particular, I think Enrique, you described it well, that there's a lot of challenges and uncertainties in the whole chain of models, not just in one particular set that may get the focus. Can we think holistically about science all the way to serving communities in a way that helps us make decisions to address those model limitations, those model challenges? Can we attack parts of that system, our science into practice system, to have the most impact?
Quite a question. I'll take a stab at it. I hope my colleagues help me out here. Save me, please. I think one of the things that is important about the modeling process for purposes of the Colorado River Basin and its flows is to keep in mind one of the lessons we learned from Kevin earlier today, humility. Models are imperfect. They have enormous limitations. If a modeler is not telling you they have enormous limitations, they're trying to sell you their model. These limitations need to be confronted daily or weekly or quarterly basis with observations. We won't make much progress if we don't confront models of the many types that we've been talking about today with observations. It could be the paleoclimate record. It could be our current observations from our great networks like SNOTEL. It could be new observations that are being obtained from satellite remote sensing, from airborne flights and platforms. The merging of the observations with the modeling will help build credibility in the models, that we can trust them for the particular task we're asking them to do, that they're the right model for the right question in the right place at the right time. Mind you, this is happening in a system that's evolving. I mean, the climate system's evolving. Our landscapes are evolving. Our human uses of these natural landscapes are evolving. For good or for bad, they're changing. So the models need to keep up with the change by integrating more and more observations. And so to get back to the science to practice, I think it's important to keep that big picture mindset and that humbleness. We're only trying to make a better decision. The alternative is to make a decision with no information, and none of us want to do that. A better way is to use models of different types. But we have to be sort of realistic in how much we believe them by confronting them with data.
I would also add to that is to, like, models are not perfect, and I think we need to confront them with data, but I also think we shouldn't be paralyzed by the uncertainty. Like, there are things that we are learning that we see consistently across the different ways in which we use the models, and so there are trends, there are things that we can pull out, and the more we know about how people are thinking about their vulnerabilities and integrate that to help us determine which models or which ways in which we should use the models we have, I think is important. And also, I mean, I hear this comparison a lot. Climate models aren't perfect, but neither are economic models, and we use economic models a lot as well. And so they're tools, and they should always be thought of as tools. They're tools we can work to verify, which is nice. Like, the physics are there that we can think through, but also, like, it's easy to be paralyzed by the uncertainty, but there is a lot there that we do know, and I think teasing it out, thinking about the interpretation, looking at it from different angles, I think there's a lot there that we do know and we can begin to plan for.
So just to add to that, I've been thinking about all of these models. Pick any of them: hydrology, climate, statistical, will never be perfect. And I think we have to contend with uncertainty. And both my panelists eloquently put it. And when I think if we are in uncertain times, even individually or community, we want to get to solutions or get to management practices that will make us more nimble and adaptive. And I think if there is one thing on the Colorado River is that it is the variability, and we saw nicely in the opening talk. So if our management regimes can make things adaptable and flexible, I think we can nimbly get through whatever comes our way. But waiting for, tell me exactly how much flow is going to be there and, without any uncertainty, that is definitely not going to happen, no matter, how much science advances, because nature, there's always uncertainty, and there's always going to be uncertainty. And I think if we can think of ways to make our management regimes more nimble, more adaptive, in a way that is equitable and also, fair across all the stakeholders, I think that is where I feel the solution lies. One that can be improved and modified as we go along. That future, people coming behind us can continually keep improving. I think that's sort of how I feel we should be thinking about.
That's a very inherently hopeful message, which I respond to. Like I said, we could talk about this stuff for days, and there are conferences that do so. We're just about to our break time, but I'd like to wrap up with a brief message building on your last note there, Balaji, as to what gives you hope as we work with these tools and systems within the challenges we're facing in the Colorado River.
Well, I'll take the hope lesson from Carlotta that she eloquently talked about the resiliency of people. And I think it is the ingenuity and resiliency that will get through. And I'll share my own personal story. When I was growing up in South Central India, we didn't have running water. And we were at the mercy of the vagaries of the monsoon. And summers, there would be less water. You would have to go out and stand in line for a couple of buckets of water. And yet people lived through, people persevere. And I think, to me, that's the hopeful message. So we will get through this because, people have lived off the river for millennia. And I always tell, if we mess this up or screw it up, we have nobody to blame. Because, we know everything, we know so much more than people who came before us. And yet they persevered, that you so nicely mentioned. So that gives me hope.
My hope also goes back to what Kevin said about the collaborative, the need for collaborations amongst us as simple human beings who can become stewards of the Colorado River, and just to aim for that and just to be collaborative. And I think that's why we're here today at this CRWUA conference. And just, as you go through the rest of the week, is just, like Julie said, reach out to each other, collaborate, find those ways to connect with scientists and managers. And each of us has knowledges to share and give to each other to reach those solutions that we need. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Echoing that, I don't know how much more I have to add. One thing I think I get really hopeful is every time I turn on the tap, water is there without even having to think about it typically. Like, that to me is incredible. Like, there's so much behind that, and the fact that it happens so readily. There's been so much innovation behind that, and so much partnership, and so much that I feel like what comes next and how we're going to solve this problem, like, we've been in tough spots before, and there's been I don't know, people have come together and made it happen, and I'll stop there.
Enrique, final hopeful message for us.
Well, hopefulness comes from the sense of urgency. And the sense of urgency, I think you all feel, you're part of this water community of the Colorado River. My only thought related to this is that in times of urgency, we dig deep into our creative bright, sharp minds. We come together and find solutions that may have been in front of us for a long time, but now become feasible because we're ready.
Awesome. Resiliency, collaboration, innovation, urgency, perseverance. Those are all pretty good messages I think we can take through the rest of the week here. Please join me in thanking our panel for some wonderful thoughts. Break time now, and be back for the next session at 3:45. Thank you all.